The December evening had settled over St. Mary Mead like a gentle benediction, bringing with it the first proper snowfall of winter and the warm glow of lamplight from cottage windows. Inside the parish church of St. Mary's, the ancient stone walls seemed to embrace the assembled villagers with a comfort born of centuries of shared worship and celebration. Tonight marked the annual Christmas carol service, a tradition as deeply rooted in the village's heart as the Norman foundations beneath their feet. Miss Jane Marple occupied her customary pew 3 rows from the back, positioned with the unconscious strategy of a lifetime observer. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, took in the familiar tableau with the quiet satisfaction of one who finds infinite fascination in the recurring patterns of human nature. She had attended this service for more than 40 years, and while the carols remained constant, the subtle dramas playing out among the congregation provided endless variation on eternal themes. The church was fuller than usual tonight, drawn perhaps by the promise of hearing Miss Rosalind Hartwell's celebrated soprano voice. Rosalind, at 26, possessed not only exceptional vocal talent, but also the kind of ethereal beauty that made men stumble over their words and women examine their own reflections with renewed scrutiny. She stood now near the altar, resplendent in a gown of midnight blue velvet, her golden hair caught up in an elegant chignon that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. Miss Marple's gaze wandered thoughtfully over the congregation. In the front pew sat Colonel Bantry and his wife Dolly, the colonel's military bearing softened by the seasonal spirit. Mrs. Bantry's attention divided between the service and her persistent worry about whether she had remembered to turn off the drawing-room fire. Dr. Haydock occupied his usual strategic position near the aisle, his medical bag discreetly placed beneath the pew, a precaution born of long experience with Mrs. Price Ridley's tendency toward theatrical swooning during emotional moments. Near the middle of the church, Miss Marple observed the Ashford family. James Ashford, the village's prosperous solicitor, his wife Margaret, and their son David, recently returned from London under circumstances that had provided considerable fodder for village speculation. Young David's attention seemed entirely focused on Miss Hartwell, his expression bearing that particular intensity that accompanies both admiration and something rather more complicated. Behind them sat Mr. Geoffrey Thornton, the London art dealer who had purchased the old Whitmore cottage 6 months prior. His presence in St. Mary Mead had been a source of considerable interest, particularly his apparent wealth and his unmarried state. Tonight, however, Miss Marple noticed that his usual urbane composure seemed somewhat strained, his fingers drumming silently against his prayer book. The Reverend Leonard Clement began the service with the traditional readings, his gentle voice carrying easily through the stone space. The congregation settled into the familiar rhythm of responses and hymns, the communal warmth growing with each shared verse. It was only when they reached the evening's centerpiece, Miss Hartwell's solo performance of Silent Night, that the peaceful atmosphere began to shift. Rosalind stepped forward to the small lectern that had been positioned near the altar, her movements graceful and assured. The congregation fell into expectant silence as Mr. Raymond Fletcher, the church organist, played the opening notes. Miss Marple found herself studying not just the soloist, but the faces around her, David Ashford's rapt attention, Mr. Thornton's oddly rigid posture, Mrs. Clement's maternal pride in her star performer. "Silent night, holy night," Rosalind began, her voice pure and clear as crystal. The familiar words seemed to take on new beauty in her interpretation, each phrase carefully shaped and delivered with genuine emotion. All is calm, all is bright. Miss Marple noticed the small glass of water that had been thoughtfully placed on the lectern, a kindness from Mrs. Clement, who remembered how nerves could affect even the most accomplished performer. She observed the way Rosalind's left hand rested lightly on the lectern's edge, the delicate gold bracelet catching the candlelight. There was something about that bracelet that seemed familiar, though Miss Marple could not immediately place the memory. The carol continued through its second verse, Rosalind's confidence growing with each phrase. The congregation seemed held in a spell, even Mrs. Price Ridley maintaining an unusual stillness. It was as Rosalind reached the final verse, "Sleep in heavenly peace," that everything changed. The young woman's voice faltered on the word sleep, not with the tremor of emotion, but with something far more alarming. Her free hand went to her throat, her eyes widening with what appeared to be genuine surprise. She reached for the glass of water, taking a small sip, then another. For a moment, it seemed she might recover, might complete the beloved carol that had filled the church with such beauty. Instead, the glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden, terrible silence. Rosalind swayed, her hand clutching at the lectern, then slowly, inexorably, crumpled to the floor beside the scattered fragments of crystal. The silence that followed was absolute. No rustle of clothing, no whispered prayers, no sound save the gentle hiss of the gas lamps. Then, as if released from a collective held breath, chaos erupted. Mrs. Clement's scream pierced the air, followed immediately by Dr. Haydock's authoritative voice, calling for calm as he hurried toward the altar. Miss Marple remained perfectly still in her pew, her knitting forgotten in her lap. While others rushed forward or recoiled in shock, she observed. She noted the expression on David Ashford's face. Not surprise, but something more complex, more troubled. She saw how Mr. Thornton's hands gripped his prayer book with white-knuckled intensity. She observed the way Mrs. Clement's maternal concern warred with something that looked remarkably like relief. But most particularly, she noticed the fragments of the shattered glass, and among them, something that glinted differently in the lamplight. Not crystal, but something smaller, more deliberate. Something that had no business being in a simple glass of water, meant to soothe a nervous throat. Dr. Haydock knelt beside Rosalind's still form, his experienced hands seeking signs of life that Miss Marple suspected he would not find. The beautiful voice that had filled their church with such joy only moments before had been silenced forever, and the carol that should have ended with peaceful benediction had instead concluded with the most profound and ominous quiet. As the Reverend Clement began the difficult task of managing his shocked congregation, Miss Marple continued her silent observation. In her long experience, she had learned that murder, like gardening, rarely produced results without careful preparation. Someone in this church tonight had planned for Rosalind Hartwell's voice to be stilled, and Miss Marple intended to discover not only who, but why. The carol had ended in silence, but Miss Marple suspected that before this Christmas season concluded, there would be a great deal more to hear. The profound silence that followed Dr. Haydock's examination seemed to stretch endlessly before he finally raised his head, his weathered face grave in the flickering gaslight. "I'm afraid Miss Hartwell is dead," he announced quietly, his professional composure barely masking his own shock. "The circumstances are most unusual. No one must touch anything until the police arrive." Reverend Clement stepped forward, his pastoral instincts struggling against the terrible reality before him. "Of course, Doctor. Mrs. Clement, would you telephone for the authorities immediately?" His voice carried the tremor of a man whose peaceful world had suddenly tilted into nightmare. Mrs. Clement hurried toward the vestry, her footsteps echoing hollowly against the ancient stones. Miss Marple observed the woman's departure with interest, noting how relief and distress warred in her expression, a curious combination that spoke of complications beyond simple grief. The congregation remained frozen in their pews, shock giving way to a creeping awareness that they were now witnesses to something far more sinister than a tragic accident. Mrs. Price Ridley fanned herself dramatically with her prayer book, while Colonel Bantry instinctively moved to comfort his wife. But it was the reactions of those closest to the altar that drew Miss Marple's particular attention. David Ashford had gone quite pale, his earlier, rapt attention to Rosalind replaced by what appeared to be genuine anguish. Yet Miss Marple detected something else beneath his distress, a quality of guilt that seemed disproportionate to mere grief. His mother, Margaret, placed a protective hand on his arm, her own face carefully composed, but her eyes watchful, calculating. Mr. Geoffrey Thornton sat rigidly upright, his metropolitan polish cracking to reveal something raw beneath. His gaze kept returning to the shattered glass near the altar, and Miss Marple noted how his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his prayer book. There was knowledge in his manner, she thought, the kind that comes from expecting disaster rather than witnessing it unexpectedly. Dr. Haydock had begun a careful examination of the scene without disturbing the evidence. Miss Marple watched him work, particularly noting his interest in the glass fragments scattered around the lectern. Among the crystal pieces, that curious glinting object caught the light again, smaller than a pearl, harder than glass, with the deliberate quality of something manufactured rather than natural. Mrs. Clement returned breathlessly from her telephone call. "Inspector Slack is on his way," she announced, her voice carrying across the hushed church. "He instructed that no one should leave and nothing should be touched." "Quite proper," murmured Miss Marple, speaking for the first time since the tragedy. Her gentle voice drew several glances, and she offered a mild smile. Such a dreadful thing to happen during our lovely service. Poor dear Rosalind was so looking forward to tonight. The arrival of Inspector Slack brought a businesslike efficiency to the proceedings. He surveyed the scene with sharp eyes, taking in the still figure, the scattered glass, and the anxious faces of the congregation. His gaze lingered momentarily on Miss Marple before he turned to Dr. Haydock. "Right then, Doctor. What can you tell me?" The young woman collapsed while singing. She'd taken water from that glass. He indicated the lectern. "Just before she fell. There are unusual circumstances that suggest—" He lowered his voice, but his meaning was clear. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "Mrs. Clement, I understand you prepared that water glass." "Yes, Inspector. At 6:30, just before the final rehearsal. I filled it from the kitchen carafe." Mrs. Clement's voice was steady, but Miss Marple observed the way her hands twisted her handkerchief. "Several people were about. Mr. Hargreaves, Raymond Fletcher at the organ, some of the choir members. Anyone might have approached the lectern." Miss Marple's mind catalogued this information while her eyes returned to Rosalind's still form. The golden bracelet on the young woman's wrist caught the light, and with it came a flutter of memory. Something about the harvest fete, a conversation overheard, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time but now pressed at the edges of her consciousness with growing insistence. "Inspector," she said gently, "you might wish to examine those glass fragments particularly carefully. I noticed something rather odd just before Miss Hartwell, before the incident occurred." Inspector Slack, who had learned to respect Miss Marple's observations, despite his occasional exasperation with her methods, knelt beside the scattered crystal. Among the fragments, the small foreign object glinted with unmistakable purpose, evidence that Rosalind Hartwell's final performance had been orchestrated by someone with murder in their heart. Inspector Slack carefully extracted the tiny object from among the crystal fragments, using his handkerchief with the precision of long experience. In the gaslight, it revealed itself as a small, translucent capsule, gelatin, partially dissolved, with the unmistakable appearance of something designed to carry and release its contents when exposed to liquid. "Poison capsule," he announced grimly, his voice cutting through the church's heavy silence. "Dissolved in the water, released its contents when the glass was handled." His sharp gaze swept the assembled congregation. "This was deliberate murder, ladies and gentlemen. No one leaves until we've taken statements from everyone present." The collective intake of breath seemed to echo off the ancient stones. Mrs. Price Ridley's fan worked frantically while Colonel Bantry instinctively straightened, his military bearing asserting itself in crisis. but Miss Marple's attention remained fixed on the subtler reactions. David Ashford's visible pallor, the way Mr. Thornton's hands trembled against his prayer book, and particularly Mrs. Clement's expression, which seemed less shocked than resigned. Dr. Haydock rose from his examination, closing his medical bag with a decisive snap. "Inspector, given the rapid onset and symptoms, we're looking at something fast-acting. The post-mortem will provide specifics, but the poor girl had no chance once she'd consumed that water." "Right then," Inspector Slack said, producing his notebook. "Mrs. Clement, you placed the glass at 6:30. Who had access to the lectern between then and the service?" Mrs. Clement's answer came with careful precision. "The church remained open for final preparations. I was in and out of the vestry. Raymond was at the organ, and several people arrived early. Miss Hartwell herself came at 7 and seemed quite herself, though perhaps nervous." Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Clement's hands worried her handkerchief, a gesture that spoke of deeper anxiety than simple grief. There was something in the woman's manner that suggested knowledge carefully contained. Raymond Fletcher stepped forward, his thin face drawn with strain. "I was here from 6:45 until 7:15, working with the organ. Miss Hartwell arrived just after 7 and asked about the lighting near the lectern. She seemed—" He paused, and Miss Marple noted the hesitation. "She seemed more than nervous. Distracted, I'd say." "Distracted how?" Inspector Slack pressed. David Ashford cleared his throat reluctantly. "Inspector, I spoke with Miss Hartwell when she arrived. She mentioned receiving some correspondence that afternoon, something that had upset her considerably. She said it concerned her past, something she'd hoped was forgotten." Margaret Ashford's grip tightened on her son's arm, a maternal gesture that Miss Marple found illuminating. The woman's protective instincts were clearly aroused, though whether for her son or against some other threat remained unclear. Mr. Thornton spoke for the first time since the tragedy, his London accent crisp. "If I may add, Inspector, Miss Hartwell appeared to be looking for someone specific among the congregation when she arrived. Her manner suggested she was expecting and dreading an encounter with someone." Miss Marple filed this observation with growing interest. In her experience, murder often sprouted from seeds planted long before the fatal moment, and Rosalind's apparent anticipation of trouble added a significant dimension to the evening's events. "Did anyone observe Miss Hartwell actually handling the water glass before the service began?" Inspector Slack's question hung in the air. The congregation exchanged glances, but no immediate response came. Miss Marple, however, recalled a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. "Inspector," she said gently, "you might find it useful to know that Miss Hartwell appeared to examine the glass rather carefully before drinking from it during her performance, almost as if she too suspected something wasn't quite right." This revelation sent a visible ripple through the assembled villagers. Mr. Thornton's face went quite pale, while Mrs. Clement's handkerchief twisting became more pronounced. From the choir stalls came a tentative voice, one of the younger singers. "Inspector, we couldn't help but overhear Miss Hartwell and Mr. Fletcher having words before the service, behind the vestry curtain. Something about timing, and she told him he must keep out of it, that she knew what she was doing." Fletcher flushed deeply. "Artists disagree about interpretation," he said stiffly. "It's part of the creative process, nothing more." Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the defensive quality of his response, and how his fingers drummed nervously against the organ bench. She also observed the golden bracelet on Rosalind's still wrist, an intricate piece that stirred a memory from the harvest fete, though she couldn't quite place the connection yet. Inspector Slack surveyed the scene once more, his expression grim. "We'll be conducting formal interviews in the vestry. Dr. Haydock, please arrange for the body to be moved, and I want this area sealed until we've finished our examination." As the congregation began to file toward the parish hall under police supervision, Miss Marple remained in her pew a moment longer. The carol, that had ended in such tragic silence had revealed far more than a simple murder. It had exposed a web of secrets, fears, and long-buried resentments that would require careful untangling. Someone among these familiar faces had planned Rosalind Hartwell's death with deliberate malice, and Miss Marple intended to discover not only who, but why. The vestry had been transformed into Inspector Slack's makeshift interrogation chamber, the ancient oak table bearing his notebook and the weight of village secrets about to be exposed. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically near the parish hall tea urn, where decades of experience had taught her that the most revealing conversations occurred during moments of apparent casualness. Mrs. Clement faced Inspector Slack first, her composed exterior betraying only the slightest tremor in her hands. "I filled the glass from our kitchen carafe at 6:30 precisely," she stated with careful precision. "Placed it directly on the lectern myself, as I always do for our soloists." "And you left it unattended?" Slack pressed. "The church remained open for final preparations. I had other duties, arranging flowers, speaking with the sidesmen." Her fingers worried at her handkerchief. Anyone might have approached the lectern during that time. Miss Marple noted the woman's measured responses, each answer carefully constructed. There was knowledge being withheld. She was certain, not necessarily guilt, but awareness of something significant. Raymond Fletcher followed, his artistic temperament clearly strained by the evening's events. "Miss Hartwell was particular about the lighting arrangements," he explained, his voice higher than usual. "She requested the candles be moved forward at 10 minutes to 7. I made the adjustments myself, though I did not touch the water glass." "You argued with her about the performance," Inspector Slack observed. Fletcher's defensiveness was immediate. A minor disagreement about musical interpretation. She wanted an unaccompanied passage in the final verse. Rather showy, in my opinion. She insisted she needed a moment of perfect silence for effect. He paused, seeming to realize the tragic irony of his words. David Ashford entered next, his youthful confidence utterly shattered. His mother, Margaret, hovered protectively near the door, her maternal instincts clearly aroused by more than simple concern. "Inspector, I won't deny I cared deeply for Miss Hartwell," David began, his voice barely steady. "We had become reacquainted since her return to St. Mary Mead. But tonight she was genuinely frightened about something. She'd received correspondence that afternoon, threatening letters, she said. Someone was attempting to expose secrets from her London days, things that would destroy her reputation here." This revelation sent ripples of understanding through Miss Marple's consciousness. Blackmail provided excellent motivation for murder, particularly if the victim had chosen resistance over submission. Margaret Ashford's intervention was swift and protective. "My son is not to be badgered, Inspector. Whatever troubles that girl brought from London have nothing to do with David's feelings for her." The phrasing struck Miss Marple as unnecessarily harsh and revealing of deeper knowledge than a concerned mother should possess. Geoffrey Thornton's interview revealed a man struggling to maintain his metropolitan composure. "Miss Hartwell and I were acquainted through London's musical circles," he stated with practiced precision. "I had offered patronage for her career development, purely professional interest, you understand." "And tonight?" Inspector Slack inquired. She seemed to be expecting someone specific among the congregation. Her manner suggested both anticipation and dread. Thornton's hands remained restless throughout his responses, and Miss Marple noted how his gaze repeatedly returned to the vestry door. During a brief recess, Miss Marple accompanied Dr. Haydock to examine the scene more closely. In the church, she observed the lectern with particular attention, noting 2 faint circular marks on the polished oak surface, one wider and fainter, another smaller and more distinct. 2 glasses had rested there, or one glass placed twice by different hands. In the kitchen scullery, the carafe stood half empty beside an inverted tumbler on a dish towel. Miss Marple examined the cloth with her knitting needle, detecting a faint, bitter residue that spoke of something more sinister than simple water. Strychnine, most likely, Dr. Haydock confirmed grimly. Whoever prepared this knew exactly what they were about. The dosage was precisely calculated for rapid effect. Back in the parish hall, Mrs. Price Ridley approached with her usual dramatic flair. Miss Marple, I couldn't help but notice that lovely bracelet Miss Hartwell wore tonight. Such delicate forget-me-nots in blue enamel. I could swear I saw something identical at the Harvest Fete, on the bric-a-brac stall donated by Mr. Thornton. The connection crystallized in Miss Marple's mind with startling clarity. She had indeed seen similar enamel work before, on Margaret Ashford's wrist years ago, and later on visiting relatives. Not unique pieces, perhaps, but in villages, patterns repeated with telling significance. As Inspector Slack prepared to focus his investigation on the obvious suspects, David Ashford with his romantic attachment, Raymond Fletcher with his professional jealousy, Miss Marple understood they were only beginning to uncover the web of secrets that had led to Rosalind Hartwell's silenced song. The bracelet, the letters, the carefully placed glass, all spoke of a conspiracy far more complex than simple passion or rivalry. Someone had orchestrated this murder with meticulous planning, and Miss Marple intended to discover not only who, but why the beautiful voice that had filled their church with such joy had been deemed worthy of eternal silence. The vestry had taken on the solemn atmosphere of a confessional as Inspector Slack methodically examined the contents of Rosalind Hartwell's small beaded reticule. Among the usual feminine necessities, powder compact, handkerchief embroidered with an elegant R and a few coins, lay a folded sheet of paper, torn raggedly across the middle as if someone had attempted to destroy it in haste. Inspector Slack unfolded the fragment with careful precision, revealing typewritten lines that sent a chill through the ancient stone chamber. You wanted a moment of perfect silence. You shall have it. Pay, or the village will learn what London knows. No signature graced the threatening message, only a faint grease mark in one corner, as if handled by nervous, oily fingers. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near the vestry threshold with the unobtrusive skill of decades, observed the letter with particular interest. "How curious, Inspector," she remarked gently. "That phrase about perfect silence. It does seem to echo something we heard earlier this evening, doesn't it?" The connection struck Inspector Slack immediately. Raymond Fletcher's defensive explanation about Rosalind's desire for an unaccompanied passage, her insistence on a moment of perfect silence for dramatic effect. The coincidence seemed too pointed to ignore, yet Miss Marple's expression suggested she found it significant for different reasons entirely. Dr. Haydock, who had been conducting a more thorough examination of the scene, approached with additional findings. "Inspector, there's something else you should see. The lectern bears traces of a distinctive perfume, violets quite concentrated. And these dual impressions on the wood surface suggest 2 glasses were placed there at different times." Miss Marple's needles paused in their gentle rhythm. Violets, specifically Devonshire violets, if her nose didn't deceive her. It was a scent she associated with one particular person in St. Mary Mead. Someone whose protective instincts had been increasingly evident throughout the evening's tragic events. Raymond Fletcher, when summoned for further questioning, appeared genuinely distraught rather than merely nervous. His usual artistic temperament had given way to something approaching despair, and under Inspector Slack's persistent questioning, he revealed information that cast the evening's events in an entirely different light. Miss Hartwell was planning to leave St. Mary Mead, he admitted reluctantly, his voice barely steady. After Christmas, we were to start fresh somewhere her past couldn't follow her. She'd been receiving those threatening letters for weeks, Inspector. Someone was demanding payment to keep silent about her London associations, connections that would have scandalized this village. This revelation transformed the investigation's focus entirely. Rosalind hadn't been the victim of sudden passion or professional jealousy, but of calculated blackmail that had escalated to murder when she refused to pay. Geoffrey Thornton, recalled for additional questioning, reluctantly expanded on his earlier admissions. Miss Hartwell had exceptional expertise in authenticating decorative arts and jewelry. She'd been assisting me with estate acquisitions, identifying pieces of particular value. But recently, she'd grown nervous about some of our clients, individuals whose reputations were, shall we say, questionable. The art dealer's hands trembled as he continued. She'd discovered that several pieces we'd authenticated had subsequently disappeared from their owners' collections. She suspected our client list had been compromised, that someone was using our expertise to facilitate theft. When she threatened to expose the operation, the threats began. Miss Marple listened to these revelations with growing understanding. The bracelet Rosalind had worn, those delicate forget-me-nots in blue enamel, suddenly took on new significance. She recalled with startling clarity a photograph that had once graced James Ashford's desk. A young woman on a seaside promenade, laughing as she shaded her eyes from the sun, her wrist bearing an identical ornament. The caption had read simply, "Im at Margate." Mrs. Price Ridley's gossip about seeing Margaret Ashford in heated conversation with Mr. Thornton outside the post office now seemed far more significant. The older woman's fierce protectiveness of her son David suggested knowledge of threats that extended beyond simple romantic rivalry. As Inspector Slack prepared to focus his investigation on the obvious suspects, David Ashford with his romantic attachment, Raymond Fletcher with his professional connection, Miss Marple understood they were only beginning to uncover the web of deception that had led to Rosalind's silenced song. The violet perfume clinging to the lectern, the carefully replaced glass, the threatening letter with its borrowed phrase, all spoke of someone who had moved through the evening's preparations with meticulous planning and intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the church's routines. Someone whose presence would seem natural, whose access would go unquestioned, and whose motive ran deeper than passion or professional jealousy. The carol that had ended in silence was revealing its secrets slowly, but Miss Marple sensed that the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. In her long experience with human nature's darker impulses, she had learned that the most calculating murderers often hid behind the most respectable facades, and that maternal love, when threatened, could prove more deadly than any romantic obsession. The snow continued to fall outside the ancient windows, softening the village's familiar contours into something strange and uncertain. Before this winter night was fully understood, Miss Marple suspected several carefully maintained reputations would lie as shattered as the crystal glass that had delivered death to a beautiful young woman whose only crime had been knowing too much about the wrong people. The parish hall had settled into an uneasy quiet, punctuated only by the soft murmur of subdued conversations and the gentle hiss of the gas lamps. Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the church proper, where the constable's presence provided an opportunity for closer examination of the scene. Inspector Slack, absorbed in his interrogations, waved her through with the distracted gesture of a man who had learned to trust her seemingly innocent curiosity. In the nave's solemn stillness, Miss Marple approached the lectern with renewed purpose. The twin impressions on the polished oak surface were indeed more distinct in the quieter light, one wider and fainter, consistent with Mrs. Clement's original placement, and another, smaller, more recent mark, positioned slightly to the right. On the inner lip of the lectern, her careful examination revealed a minute smudge that glinted faintly in the candlelight. She touched it delicately with her handkerchief, bringing the fabric to her nose. Violets, not the light, pleasant scent one might expect from a lady's toilette, but something more concentrated, more deliberately applied. The kitchen scullery yielded additional secrets to her methodical investigation. The dish towel beneath the inverted tumbler bore not one but two distinct water rings, suggesting glasses had been dried and replaced multiple times throughout the evening's preparations. More significantly, that same concentrated violet fragrance clung to the carafe's rim, evidence that whoever had handled the poisoned glass had also prepared the water source. Returning to the parish hall, Miss Marple positioned herself strategically near the tea urn, where Margaret Ashford maintained her vigil with rigid composure. The woman's protective attention remained focused entirely on her son David, but Miss Marple noted subtle details that spoke of deeper knowledge than maternal concern alone could explain. "Such a terrible tragedy," Miss Marple remarked gently, accepting a cup from Margaret's steady hands. "Poor Rosalind seemed so nervous when she arrived tonight, almost as if she were expecting some particular difficulty." Margaret's response came with careful precision. "Young women from London often carry complications with them. David was quite taken with her, but I feared her background might prove unsuitable for village life." The phrasing struck Miss Marple as revealing. Margaret spoke of Rosalind's past with the authority of specific knowledge rather than general suspicion. Moreover, the concentrated violet scent that Miss Marple had detected on the evidence was unmistakably present on Margaret herself. Devonshire violets, applied with the liberal hand of someone accustomed to masking other odors. Mrs. Price Ridley approached with her characteristic dramatic flair, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "Miss Marple, I simply cannot stop thinking about that lovely bracelet poor Rosalind wore tonight. Such delicate forget-me-nots in blue enamel. I could swear I saw something remarkably similar at the harvest fete. On Mr. Thornton's bric-a-brac stall, wasn't it? Though now that I consider it, I'm almost certain I remember Mrs. Ashford wearing something very like it years ago." Miss Marple observed Margaret's reaction with particular interest. The woman's composure remained intact, but her grip on the tea service tightened perceptibly. "There are many such pieces," Margaret replied with studied casualness. "Enamel work was quite popular in the previous generation." From across the hall, one of the younger choir members approached with obvious hesitation. "Mrs. Ashford," she said tentatively, "I hope you don't mind my mentioning, but when Miss Hartwell reached for her water glass during the performance, she seemed to pause, almost as if something about it surprised her. She looked at her fingers afterward as if they were sticky." This observation sent a visible tremor through Margaret's carefully maintained facade. Miss Marple filed the detail with growing understanding. A gelatin capsule would dissolve cleanly, but perfume applied to mask handling would indeed leave a residue. David Ashford joined his mother with obvious distress, his voice low but audible to Miss Marple's attentive ears. "Mother, Inspector Slack is asking very specific questions about Rosalind's background. He seems to know more about her London connections than we realized." Margaret's response was swift and protective. "David, you must not involve yourself further in this matter. Some associations are better left unexplored, particularly when they concern family reputation." The word family hung in the air with particular significance, and Miss Marple recalled with sudden clarity the photograph that had once graced James Ashford's desk. A young woman on a seaside promenade, her wrist bearing an identical enamel bracelet. The caption had read simply, "M at Margate," but now Miss Marple wondered if it might have been Margaret at Margate. Or perhaps someone whose connection to the Ashford family ran deeper than casual acquaintance. Inspector Slack's return from the vestry brought new urgency to the proceedings. "We've discovered additional correspondence," he announced grimly. "Half-burned letters in the vestry wastebasket, all addressed to Miss Hartwell. Someone attempted to destroy evidence after the murder." Margaret Ashford's reaction was subtle but telling. Not surprise, but a kind of grim resignation, as if long-anticipated consequences were finally arriving. Miss Marple noted how the woman's violet-scented gloves remained carefully positioned to avoid contact with potentially incriminating surfaces. As Inspector Slack prepared to intensify his investigation, Miss Marple understood that the evening's tragedy was revealing layers of deception far more complex than simple blackmail or romantic jealousy. The carol that had ended in silence was beginning to expose secrets that reached into the very heart of St. Mary Mead's most respectable families, and she suspected that the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. The snow continued its gentle descent outside the ancient windows, softening the village's familiar contours into something strange and uncertain. Before this winter night was fully understood, Miss Marple realized the careful facades that protected certain reputations would prove as fragile as the crystal glass that had delivered death to a young woman whose greatest mistake had been knowing too much about the wrong people. The constable's discovery came with the quiet efficiency that often accompanies the most significant revelations. Miss Marple, who had returned to the church under the pretext of retrieving her forgotten prayer book, noticed immediately what others had missed in their earlier examinations. The delicate forget-me-not bracelet that had adorned Rosalind's wrist throughout the evening was no longer there. "Inspector Slack," she called gently, her voice carrying the particular tone that had learned to command attention through decades of quiet observation. "I believe you should examine Miss Hartwell's person once more. Something rather important appears to be missing." The absence of the bracelet sent ripples of new urgency through the investigation. Dr. Haydock confirmed what Miss Marple had observed. The jewelry had definitely been present during his initial examination, which meant someone had removed it from the body after the murder. This wasn't mere theft. It was evidence tampering by someone desperate to conceal a connection to the victim. Inspector Slack's methodical search of the parish hall and its occupants yielded nothing, but Miss Marple's gentle suggestion proved more fruitful. "In my experience, Inspector, guilty persons often hide objects in places associated with virtue or charity. It provides a curious comfort to the conscience." The poor box beside the church door, accessible to anyone during the evening's chaos, surrendered its secret readily enough. Wrapped in brown paper and nestled among the modest coins, the enamel forget-me-nots seemed to gleam with accusatory brightness in the gaslight. Margaret Ashford's reaction to this discovery was masterfully controlled. No surprise, no protestation of innocence, merely a subtle stiffening of her shoulders as if bracing against an expected blow. Miss Marple observed this response with particular interest, noting how it suggested preparation rather than shock. The burned letters from the vestry waste-basket revealed their secrets under closer examination. Miss Marple's careful study of the charred fragments yielded a crucial insight that had escaped Inspector Slack's initial assessment. These letters weren't burned during the murder itself, she remarked thoughtfully. Miss Hartwell was singing when she collapsed. There would have been no opportunity. Someone destroyed this correspondence afterward, someone with access to the vestry during our confusion. This deduction cast the evidence in an entirely different light. The person who had burned the letters was the same individual who had later removed the bracelet. Someone moving through the evening's aftermath with calculated purpose, while others remained paralyzed by shock. Dr. Haydock's continued examination of the crime scene provided additional confirmation of Miss Marple's growing suspicions. The concentrated violet perfume that clung to the lectern and carafe wasn't merely evidence of feminine presence. It was a deliberate attempt to mask other scents, possibly the bitter almond odor that often accompanied certain poisons. Margaret Ashford's earlier presence in the kitchen scullery, ostensibly to assist with refreshment preparations, now took on sinister significance. Mrs. Clement's reluctant admission that Margaret had spent considerable time alone with the water service provided both opportunity and means for the careful preparation of the poisoned glass. But it was Mrs. Price Ridley's innocent gossip that provided the final piece of Miss Marple's emerging understanding. "Such a coincidence about that bracelet," the elderly woman confided during a quiet moment near the tea urn. "I could have sworn I remembered Margaret wearing something identical years ago when she first came to St. Mary Mead. Though now that I think of it, wasn't there some talk about James Ashford's first wife? Such a tragedy, dying so young, and Margaret marrying him so soon afterward." The revelation struck Miss Marple with crystalline clarity. The photograph in James Ashford's study, M at Margate, hadn't depicted Margaret at all, but rather the first Mrs. Ashford, whose identity Margaret had systematically assumed along with her jewelry, her past, and her place in respectable village society. Rosalind Hartwell's blackmail hadn't been about art theft or authentication fraud. It had been about a far more personal secret. The truth about Margaret's identity and the circumstances surrounding the first Mrs. Ashford's convenient death. The threatening letters, the desperate attempts to silence Rosalind, the careful orchestration of murder during the Christmas service, all spoke of someone protecting a deception that had taken decades to construct. As Inspector Slack prepared to focus his investigation on the obvious suspects with their clear motives and passionate attachments, Miss Marple understood that the true conspiracy lay hidden beneath years of carefully maintained respectability. Margaret Ashford's fierce protection of her son David wasn't merely maternal instinct. It was the desperate defense of a woman whose entire existence depended on keeping certain truths buried forever. The carol that had ended in silence was revealing its secret slowly, but Miss Marple sensed that the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. In her long experience with human nature's capacity for deception, she had learned that the most calculating murderers often hid behind the most unassailable facades, and that the lengths to which people would go to protect their carefully constructed lives could prove more deadly than any passionate crime. The snow continued its gentle descent outside the ancient windows, transforming the familiar village into something strange and uncertain. Before this winter night was fully understood, Miss Marple suspected the careful distinctions between victim and perpetrator, between past and present, between Margaret Ashford and the woman whose life she had stolen, would prove as fragile as the crystal glass that had delivered death to someone who had simply known too much about the wrong person's buried secrets. The late hour had drawn the parish hall into an atmosphere of exhausted tension when Dr. Haydock returned from his consultation with the constable, his expression more certain than before. He drew Inspector Slack aside, and Miss Marple, with the natural gravitational pull that her presence seemed to exert on important conversations, found herself included in their hushed conference. "I can be more definitive now," Dr. Haydock announced quietly. There was a distinct bitter almond odor about the lips and in the froth. The capsule released cyanide, not strychnine as I initially suspected. Fast as lightning, the poor girl would have had no chance once she'd consumed that water. Inspector Slack's expression hardened. Cyanide requires only moments. Whoever placed that capsule knew exactly what they were about. This wasn't left to chance. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The concentrated violet perfume she had detected made perfect sense now. A deliberate attempt to mask the telltale scent that might have warned Rosalind of her danger. Someone had planned this murder with meticulous attention to every detail. Before Inspector Slack could resume his methodical interrogations, a commotion erupted from the lane outside. The parish hall door burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and a frantic churchwarden whose face bore the pallor of fresh catastrophe. "Inspector, there's been an incident at Whitmore Cottage. Gas! Mr. Thornton's inside and the place reeks of it." The assembled company moved with urgent purpose through the snow-muffled streets, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. At Geoffrey Thornton's cottage, the sickly, sweet smell of escaping gas created an ominous atmosphere around the arts and crafts dwelling. Inspector Slack shouldered the door while Dr. Haydock, handkerchief pressed to his mouth, rushed toward the small study where yellow lamplight bled around hastily drawn curtains. The window had been clumsily stuffed with what appeared to be a rolled carpet, while the gas fire gaped open like a hungry maw. Geoffrey Thornton lay slumped at his desk, unconscious but breathing, a brandy glass barely touched at his elbow. Working with efficient coordination, Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack dragged the unconscious man to safety, while Miss Marple observed the scene with her characteristic attention to detail. On the desk, beside the untouched brandy, lay a single sheet of paper bearing a typewritten message. "I can endure no more. The girl forced my hand. "Forgive me." It was signed with a shaky G. As Dr. Haydock worked to revive Thornton, Miss Marple studied the suicide note with growing interest. The typeface bore distinctive irregularities. A lowercase r that bit too deeply into the paper, an E that printed faintly at the top as if the type bar had been damaged long ago. These defects were unmistakably familiar to someone who had spent decades posting village notices. "The vicarage typewriter," she announced with quiet certainty. Inspector Slack's head snapped toward her. "You're certain?" "As certain as a woman can be who has typed half the parish announcements in St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple replied with gentle authority. "Those particular defects have been troubling Mrs. Clement for months." Thornton, revived enough to speak, protested his innocence with genuine indignation. "Suicide? Absurd. I returned home to find a note pushed under my door, then felt suddenly dizzy. Someone tried to murder me, Inspector, not the reverse." Miss Marple's examination of the makeshift window covering revealed it to be not a carpet at all, but a length of choir cassock, its hem weighted with the lead tape that the parish seamstress had complained about during Easter preparations. The path outside bore only one clear set of footprints in the snow, narrow, practical boots with a distinctive nick in the sole at the outer heel. "Someone walked from the church carrying church linens," Miss Marple observed. "Someone with access to both the vicarage typewriter and the vestry supplies. Someone who moves between these locations without attracting notice." When they returned to the parish hall, the attempted misdirection became even clearer. Mrs. Clement listened to Inspector Slack's account with pale composure, but Miss Marple noted the grey, sooty smudge on her gloves, consistent with adjusting a stubborn gas tap. However, the violet perfume that had clung so persistently to the murder scene was notably absent from Mrs. Clement's person. Margaret Ashford, by contrast, maintained her position near her son David, that concentrated violet scent still faintly detectable despite the evening's events. Her reaction to the cottage incident was telling, not surprise at the attempt on Thornton's life, but a kind of grim calculation, as if weighing whether this new development would deflect suspicion or create additional complications. Miss Marple understood that they were witnessing a desperate attempt at misdirection. The real murderer, sensing the investigation closing in, had tried to eliminate a potential witness while simultaneously creating a false confession that would end the inquiry. The use of the vicarage typewriter was meant to implicate Mrs. Clement, but the execution had been flawed, too hurried, too obviously staged. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "you might find it illuminating to examine Mrs. Ashford's boots for any distinctive wear patterns, and perhaps compare the handwriting on that suicide noster with samples from your various suspects." Margaret Ashford's composure remained intact, but Miss Marple observed the subtle tightening around her eyes, the way her violet-scented gloves gripped her handbag with increased tension. The woman who had spent decades perfecting a false identity was now watching that carefully constructed life crumble with each new piece of evidence. The carol that had ended in silence was revealing its secrets in layers. First, the murder itself, then the desperate attempts to cover it up, and finally the growing desperation of someone whose entire existence depended on keeping certain truths buried forever. Miss Marple sensed that the most dangerous moment was yet to come, when a cornered killer would make one final, desperate attempt to preserve the life they had stolen from another. The snow continued its gentle descent outside the ancient windows, transforming the familiar village into something strange and uncertain. Before this winter night was fully understood, Miss Marple suspected, the careful distinctions between victim and perpetrator, between past and present, between Margaret Ashford and the woman whose identity she had assumed, would prove as fragile as the crystal glass that had delivered death to someone who had simply known too much about the wrong person's buried secrets. The examination of Margaret Ashford's boots revealed precisely what Miss Marple had anticipated. a distinctive nick in the outer heel that matched the footprints leading to and from Thornton's cottage. Inspector Slack held the evidence with grim satisfaction, comparing the distinctive wear pattern against the plaster cast his constable had taken from the snow. "Mrs. Ashford," Inspector Slack announced with official gravity, "these prints place you at Mr. Thornton's cottage during the time of the attempted murder. The grey residue on your gloves is consistent with adjusting a gas tap, and the handwriting analysis of that forged suicide note shows remarkable similarities to your own hand." Margaret's response displayed the composure of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of deception. "I visited Mr. Thornton earlier this evening to discuss David's future prospects," she stated with practiced precision. "The man was distraught about Miss Hartwell's death and spoke wildly of ending his own life. I attempted to dissuade him naturally." David Ashford stepped forward with protective instincts that did him credit, though Miss Marple noted how his mother's hand on his arm restrained rather than welcomed his support. "Inspector, you're making a terrible mistake," David protested, his voice carrying the passionate conviction of filial loyalty. "My mother has lived in St. Mary Mead for 25 years, with nothing but respectability and service to the community." Miss Marple found this defense particularly poignant, knowing as she did that David was defending not his actual mother, but the woman who had assumed that role after eliminating the rightful occupant. She approached Margaret with the gentle directness that had served her so well in previous encounters with desperate criminals. "Such a comfort, tea," Miss Marple said gently, offering Margaret a fresh cup. "And so very revealing, I always think. People are never quite themselves until they hold a warm cup in cold hands." The violet fragrance, faint but unmistakable, rose around Margaret as she accepted the offering. "Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple continued with inexorable gentleness, "I believe you knew Miss Hartwell rather better than you initially indicated. The bracelet she wore tonight, those delicate forget-me-nots in blue enamel, they held particular significance, didn't they?" Margaret's careful mask flickered for the first time that evening. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, but her voice carried a tremor that spoke of recognition and fear. "Violets are curious things," Miss Marple observed conversationally, dabbing delicately at a pale smear of scent that lingered on the nearby table. "A dear friend once told me their essence plays tricks with the nose. One can smell them strongly at first, and then, quite suddenly, nothing at all. Most treacherous if one relies upon scent for warning." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "That bracelet belonged to the original Mrs. Ashford, James's first wife, the woman whose identity you assumed after her convenient death. There's a tiny flaw underneath the fifth petal of the second forget-me-not, a jeweler's repair from years ago, barely visible unless one knows to look." Miss Marple held the recovered bracelet lightly on her palm. Margaret did not look at it directly, but Miss Marple observed how her violet-scented gloves gripped her handbag with increased tension. "You see," Miss Marple continued softly, "Rosalind knew objects. She would have noticed that flaw when she fastened the bracelet, just as she noticed the concentrated perfume on her fingers from the poisoned glass. And she would have asked herself why a village solicitor's wife possessed a trinket that once belonged to another Mrs. Ashford entirely." The accusation struck home with devastating accuracy. Margaret's composure finally began to crack, revealing something raw and frightened beneath the cultivated exterior. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the parish hall's hushed atmosphere. "I loved James, truly loved him. She was dying anyway, wasting away with consumption. I simply helped her find peace." David's shocked intake of breath seemed to echo through the ancient space. The young man stared at the woman he had called mother for his entire conscious life, struggling to reconcile this confession with 25 years of apparent devotion. "And when Rosalind threatened to expose your secret," Miss Marple continued with relentless compassion, "you realized that everything you had built, your marriage, your position in the community, David's future, would be destroyed if the truth emerged. So you used Mrs. Clement's typewriter to create threatening letters, hoping to frighten Rosalind into silence. When that failed, you prepared the poisoned water glass, masking the telltale scent with your concentrated violet perfume. Margaret's nod was barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of complete defeat. "It was not theft that frightened me," she admitted, her voice growing stronger with the relief of confession. "It was recognition. Rosalind connected the bracelet to a photograph and a name that did not belong to me. She would have seen that the first Mrs. Ashford's pieces had made their way, bit by bit, onto my wrist and into my life." Inspector Slack moved forward with professional efficiency, but Margaret's gaze remained fixed on David, her expression carrying a mixture of love, regret, and desperate hope that somehow, despite everything, her son might understand the twisted logic that had driven her to such extremes. "I will not be humiliated in the parish hall," she said suddenly, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "If you have accusations, you will make them to my husband." David moved instinctively toward her. "Mother, stay where you are," she commanded, the violet scent eddying as she turned toward the door. "If you love me, you will not follow." Miss Marple watched the set of the woman's jaw and sighed softly. She had seen that particular resolve before. It did not end in confession or surrender. It ended in flight or in final, desperate action. She touched Inspector Slack's sleeve with gentle urgency. "She will not go to her husband," Miss Marple said quietly. "She will go to the church, and I fear what she means to do there." The carol that had ended in silence was finally revealing its most terrible secret. Not just murder, but the systematic destruction of one life to steal another, maintained through decades of careful deception until a young woman's knowledge had threatened to bring the entire edifice crashing down. Now, as Margaret Ashford moved toward her final, desperate gambit, Miss Marple understood that the night's tragedies were not yet complete. The church stood in profound silence, its ancient stones holding the memory of the evening's tragedy like a chalice holds wine. Miss Marple approached the half-open door with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that desperate souls, when cornered, required the gentlest handling. Behind her, Inspector Slack and David Ashford moved with restrained urgency through the snow-muffled churchyard. Inside, Margaret Ashford knelt before the altar where Rosalind Hartwell had drawn her final breath, her violet-scented figure creating a tableau of devotion and desperation. The gaslight flickered against the ancient stones, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the weight of buried secrets finally exposed to scrutiny. "Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple called gently, her voice carrying the particular tone she reserved for wounded creatures who might yet prove dangerous. "Such a peaceful place for reflection, isn't it? One can think so clearly here, away from the complications of daily life." Margaret turned slowly, her composed mask finally cracking to reveal the raw desperation beneath. In her hands, she held a small vial identical to the capsule that had delivered death earlier that evening. "You've come to see me arrested," she said, her voice carrying the bitter weight of inevitable defeat. "I have come," Miss Marple replied with characteristic gentleness, "to prevent further tragedy. But first, perhaps you might help me with something that has been troubling me all evening." She produced 2 tumblers from her handbag, simple glasses borrowed from the vestry. "Mrs. Clement will rest easier if these are properly arranged for morning prayer. Would you be so kind as to place them just as they were tonight? I am quite hopeless with such arrangements." Without conscious thought, Margaret moved to the lectern and positioned the glasses with automatic precision. The wider glass to the left, the smaller to the right, where a faint ring still marked the oak surface. Then, with the ingrained neatness of decades, she rubbed the rim with her handkerchief, her violet-scented gloves leaving their telltale fragrance. "Habit is very telling," Miss Marple observed sadly. "We do in crisis what we have always done. That unconscious precision, that need for order, it speaks of someone who has spent years perfecting the art of appearing natural while living a lie." Margaret withdrew her hand as though the lectern had burned her. "You knew," she whispered. "From the beginning you knew." "I suspected when I noticed the bracelet," Miss Marple admitted. "Those delicate forget-me-nots in blue enamel with their tiny repair beneath the fifth petal. Rosalind's expert eye would have detected that flaw immediately when she fastened the clasp. She would have recognized it as a piece that predated your supposed arrival in St. Mary Mead." David stepped forward from the shadows, his voice thick with emotion, but steady with newfound maturity. "Tell me about my real mother," he said quietly. "Tell me the truth about what happened to her." Margaret's composure shattered completely. "Your mother was beautiful," she whispered, tears finally flowing freely. "Gentle, refined, everything I was not. I was her companion during the consumption that was slowly killing her. But she began to recover, you see. The doctors said she might live for years, and I watched James fall in love with a woman who would claim the life I had dreamed of for myself." The confession poured out like water from a broken dam. So the laudanum was for her pain initially. I simply increased the dose when it became clear she would survive to reclaim her place. She went peacefully, gratefully even. And when James grieved, I was there to comfort him. When you needed a mother, I was ready to provide that love. But Rosalind discovered the deception, Miss Marple continued gently. Her expertise in authentication extended beyond art to the careful examination of lives and their accessories. When she began asking questions about death certificates and burial records, you knew your carefully constructed existence was crumbling. Margaret raised the vial toward her lips with trembling hands. "I cannot face the shame, the scandal. I cannot bear to see David's love turn to disgust when he fully understands what his mother has done." David moved closer, his voice carrying strength born of sudden understanding. "Then don't make me watch you die as well. Whatever you've done, you raised me with love. That wasn't false, was it? That wasn't stolen from someone else?" The question struck Margaret with devastating force. The vial slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone floor in a crystalline echo of the evening's earlier tragedy. She collapsed forward, her sobs filling the ancient space as Inspector Slack moved forward with professional gentleness to complete his duty. Miss Marple remained by the door, watching as the carol that had ended in silence finally reached its true conclusion, not in death, but in the painful acknowledgement of truth. The investigation was complete, but the healing would require much longer. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering St. Mary Mead in pristine white that would, by morning, make everything appear clean and new again. But Miss Marple knew that some stains went deeper than snow could cover, and that the echoes of this Christmas Eve would resonate through the village for years to come. The gray dawn broke slowly over St. Mary Mead, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of muted silver and pearl. Miss Marple sat in her familiar chair beside the sitting-room window, her knitting needles moving with their customary gentle rhythm as she observed the village returning to its patterns. The snow had indeed covered everything in pristine white, but beneath that deceptive purity, the fundamental relationships of their small community had been forever altered. Inspector Slack arrived mid-morning, his official duties complete, but his curiosity unsatisfied. He settled into the offered chair with visible relief, accepting tea with hands still cold from the morning's paperwork. "I confess, Miss Marple, I'm still piecing together how you unraveled it all. The evidence was there, but the connections—" Miss Marple smiled gently, pausing in her knitting. "It began with Mrs. Price Ridley's innocent observation about the bracelet, Inspector. Those delicate forget-me-nots in blue enamel with their distinctive flaw beneath the fifth petal. Rosalind's expert eye would have recognized it immediately as belonging to the original Mrs. Ashford, not the woman who had assumed her identity." She continued with characteristic precision. "The violet perfume was Margaret's undoing, really. Too concentrated, too deliberately applied. She used it to mask the bitter almond scent of cyanide, but it created its own trail of evidence. The choir member's observation that Rosalind's fingers felt sticky after touching the glass revealed the gelatin capsule's residue, clinging to that perfume-laden surface. Inspector Slack nodded thoughtfully. And the lectern marks. 2 distinct impressions. Precisely. Mrs. Clement always places the soloist's glass in the same position, but Margaret had moved it slightly, perhaps to ensure the capsule was perfectly positioned. Her unconscious repetition of that exact placement later, even in her distressed state, spoke of meticulous planning and deeply ingrained habits. Dr. Haydock joined them shortly after, ostensibly checking on Miss Marple's constitution, but actually seeking his own understanding of the tragedy's scope. "The attempted murder of Thornton was desperate misdirection," he observed. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed sadly. "The vicarage typewriter with its distinctive flaws, the church linen used to block the window, her own footprints in the snow, all evidence of someone driven to extreme measures to protect a life built upon deception. She sought to eliminate a potential witness while creating a false confession to end the investigation." As the day progressed, David Ashford appeared at her door, aged years in a single night, but walking with newfound steadiness. The young man had spent the morning visiting various villages, not to explain or justify, but to begin understanding who he truly was beneath the loving lies that had shaped his existence. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you, not just for solving the case, but for showing mercy in how you revealed the truth. My mother, the woman I called mother, genuinely loved me, didn't she? That wasn't part of the deception." Miss Marple's expression softened with maternal warmth. "Love, dear boy, is perhaps the one thing that cannot be successfully counterfeited. Whatever Margaret's crimes, her devotion to you was absolutely genuine. That truth will serve you well in the difficult days ahead." The Reverend Clement arrived as afternoon shadows lengthened, seeking guidance about restoring sanctity to his violated church. Miss Marple considered his concern with characteristic wisdom. "I think, Vicar, that sanctity lies not in the absence of sin, but in the presence of truth and the possibility of redemption. Your church witnessed terrible things, but it also saw confession and the beginning of healing. That seems quite sacred to me." As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the human capacity for both profound evil and unexpected resilience. Margaret Ashford had committed terrible crimes in pursuit of a life she felt she deserved, yet she had also raised David with genuine love and contributed meaningfully to the community for 25 years. The complexity of human nature, she thought, defied simple categorization. The carol that had ended in silence would not be forgotten in St. Mary Mead, but neither would it define them. Villages, like people, possessed remarkable powers of recovery when faced with trauma. The bonds of community, tested by revelation and tragedy, would reform in new patterns that acknowledged both the darkness they had witnessed and their collective determination to move forward with greater wisdom. Miss Marple set aside her knitting as winter darkness gathered outside her window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries to unravel, new opportunities to observe the endless, fascinating patterns of human behavior. Tonight, she was content to sit in her peaceful sitting room, knowing that truth had prevailed, and justice, however painful, had been served. The snow continued to fall gently outside, covering St. Mary Mead in pristine white that would by morning make everything appear clean and new again. And perhaps, Miss Marple thought with quiet optimism, that appearance might not be entirely deceptive after all.